Hello out there. So I am more than happy to present this stream to the ether, but I am wondering if there's anybody live. If you are, just say hi. Give me a temperature check. How are you feeling today? First Monday of February. It feels like, I don't know if everybody's been feeling this, but January felt like the longest year of my life. It was like, it's still January. It's still January. It's still January. And it even had vacation in it. All right, so my name is Candace Moore, and tonight I will be talking about the multiple choice on the AP Literature exam, AP English Literature and Composition. Nobody says that full name. But this is just a really high-flying overview. Oh, hi, Mary Eileen. This is just a really high-flying overview. I just want to, talk about what you'll see, what you might do to prepare. There are some further streams coming up that are going to dive more deeply into different types of questions or questions on the various types of passages. So today is just really an overview. It might be review, but as we turn the corner into this second semester, I feel like wherever you are, we're turning the corner into the spring semester. You might be starting AP Lit this semester. You might be continuing. So just the real high flying things. But if you have any specific questions or I spur a question in you, feel free to drop it in the chat. I feel like when there are small streams or small audiences, dropping it in the chat is even more convenient than posting it in the ask a question function. So before we begin, here is the weekly stream calendar. This is just generally what happens on each day. Mondays are math and English. There's a statistics stream happening right now. So if you take both of those, maybe you want to invest in the replays. But calculus is happening tonight. Statistics, Lang just ended. Tomorrow is social science. So there's a human geo and sovereignty and centripetal and centrifugal. I always get those confused. Fourth, there's a psychology stream on development, maturation, and gender. And at 9 o'clock tomorrow night Eastern, there's going to be review of legislative and judicial branches, which is super relevant right now as we go through some things that are tying those together and untangling them. Wednesdays are science every week. This week, we're going to have a environmental science and a physics at 7, a biology on meiosis, an intro to heredity. I can't read tonight. I'm an English teacher, I promise. And then a 9 o'clock chemistry tomorrow. And then Thursdays are history, AP World, US, and Euro. So Euro is going to be talking about romanticism and realism. US is going to be talking about empire building in the United States. And world history is going to have a multiple choice practice. So if you've already been through unit 5 and 6, you can get a review on the content as well as talk about multiple choice in AP World. So every week, though, Mondays are math and English, Tuesdays are social science, Wednesdays are science, and Thursdays are history. So you can keep those in mind. The subject, the course, will be at the same time every week. So 8 o'clock p.m. on Mondays is our English Lit time, and here we are. Also, if you're not following Fiveable, I don't know what you're doing with your life. Get on for the support, stay on for the memes, or vice versa. And it's at all these, it's blue, pink, and red. Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, it can be found and followed. So in this stream, I'm going to be talking about AP Lit multiple choice. Like I said, just a really high level overview. What you're going to see, when you're going to see it, and where you're going to find it. Then talk a little bit about the different question types that you'll see and what they'll be asking you to do. And then just kind of some tips so that you can make predictions to personalize your plan. I love alliteration. And then talk about practice. The answer to that question is yes, practice. Practice long and feel free to practice wrong because practice makes permanent. You're building your skills practice timed, practice untimed. I'll get back to that. So the first thing, that these are a bunch of facts that you might know already. The multiple choice, like most AP exams, comes first. So when you sit down and you open all those plastic packages and you take out all the labels and you've already filled out all the information, it's what comes first. You're going to have 60 minutes to answer 55 questions, which is, as you can see, slightly more than a minute a question, which is something that definitely needs to be planned for, because there will also be their passage-based questions. And so you'll have at least 4 passages. And so, you know, if it's evenly divided, you have 55 divided by 4, somewhere between 11 and 12, but there will be between 8 and 13 questions per passage. You're going to have at least 2 prose passages and at least 2 poetry passages. So if there are 4 passages, they'll be evenly divided. If there are 5, then you will have a lean in some direction. But those prose passages and those poetry passages will be spread across the history of literature, really. You could have something written in 1897 or 1997 or 1597. It could happen. So you have to be prepared, make sure that when you do practice, you're practicing across a number of different kinds of passages, that you're looking not only at prose, but also at poetry, and that you have an understanding that there will be 4 and maybe 5 passages on the exam, and be able to plan for that. The sequence of the questions usually go from the beginning of the passage to the end of the passage, which means that in terms of line references, number 2 is going to be, you know, maybe the first, and the last will be toward the end. But usually what happens is it goes beginning to end, and then it asks bigger questions like tone, like theme, things that you have to read the whole passage in order to get. How much it matters. So it counts for 45% of the exam, which is why I have this scale. It's slightly tipped, right? So 55% is going to be what you write, but a strong 45% is going to be the questions that you're answering. So keep that in mind. Now, according to the old rules, before the rubric changed for the essays, it used to be that if you had 55% correct on the multiple choice, that you were headed toward a 3 on the exam. So it used to be 55% multiple choice and a total of 15 essay points. But now that the essay rubric has changed and it's 6 instead of 9, I think we have to wait until a whole test goes through so that we can see what that formula is. But I would say that it's going to be in the same general ballpark, because that hasn't changed. 55% or higher, you are, you know, passing, depending on where you're going and what they take credit for. So the skills, turns out, the skills that are assessed are the same skills that you need to write the essays. So you have to be able to read and analyze, interpret quickly. So it's just a little bit more on the spot in terms of the application of those skills, but it's those same skills. And we'll look at those skills in a moment. If you've ever been introduced to the AP standards, it's those same buckets of things that you need to be able to do. So these are the big buckets of question types. You're going to interpret figurative language. It's not really going to ask you to identify figurative language. You may have had some practices in class or in a review book, an older review book that had you identifying the figurative language, like, you know, the figurative device in lines 4 through 7 is A, and then you have metaphor, simile, juxtaposition, hyperbole. But they're really leaning away from those questions so that people don't spend time memorizing terms, so that you're more likely to need to be able to apply a term than you are to be able to identify a term. And so probably if you haven't had a lot of vocabulary in your AP Lit class, it's because your teacher knows that identification is not, even if there are any at all, there will be very, very few. So it's not a huge, part of the exam. So you're going to interpret figurative language. You're going to analyze an author's creation of setting, character, and structure, any or all of those. You're looking at how the author has created those, like what are the pieces that go into it, for example, figurative language, but also then coming back out of it, what does that create? What's the impact of that character, setting, or structure on the passage as a whole? You're going to identify and analyze tone. Those might have identification options. The tone is, and you have to choose. Because even if you can identify the tone, it means that you have actually interpreted and analyzed the passage. Same with theme. There might be a question about the meaning. There might be a question about the message. There might be a question about a central idea. So it's going to ask you, and again, those would be the kind of questions you would find at the end of the passage. And really, I like to break them up into these three buckets. I keep saying buckets, but these three big, umbrellas of factual, technical, and analytical. And those increase in complexity. So a factual question would ask you what actually happened in the passage. It might be leaning into analyzing structure, but it's going to be a pretty basic reading comprehension. And by basic, I mean AP basic, which is at the top of a general literature class. Then technical would be things like interpreting figurative language, being able to look at what's been done, what the author has done, the choices that an author has made. And then analytical is those bigger ideas like tone and theme. If you took AP language, those are the kinds of things you would ask, like purpose. And so those are going to be asking for bigger, deeper analysis. And so you kind of look at it like the questions could be on the lines, like what you literally see on the page, could be between the lines, which is more like interpretation, or beyond the lines, which would be you really making strong inferences about the author's choices and the author's creation of such ideas. So when you are looking at what's going to be asked, again, all of these bullets or non-bullets are those big skills for the AP literature course. And so everything that you've been doing has been in some way helping you build the skills that are here. And so this is the kind of, as they, grow from smallest to largest, the weights of the questions that will be asked. So explain the function of setting. You're probably not going to have too many setting questions because, first of all, they're short passages. And so either it's going to be very setting heavy or not at all. And also because I think usually when it's asking about the function of setting, it's leaning into something else like imagery or that kind of figurative language that's going to create it and analyze it. So you won't see too many questions about setting. It is 3 to 6% of the questions. So very, very small, thinking about how the setting has affected whoever is in the passage. 10 to 13% each is explain the function of word choice, imagery, and symbols, explain the function of comparison, which really just means metaphors, and then also develop textually substantiated arguments based on interpretation. And so obviously, because it's multiple choice, you're not going to be asked to write out those arguments, but you will be asked to select the argument that is most strongly textually substantiated, given options of arguments about the passage. So that's 10 to 13% each. So these three big umbrellas are going to cover, 30 to 39% of the questions. The next biggest bucket is 16 to 20%, and that's looking at character, plot, and structure. And so from being in class that it is, 30 to 40% of your time is spent explaining the functions of a character, the functions of the structure. Structure is more likely to be a poetry question in terms of poetry form or some such, but it could be flashback. It could be, some sort of prose structure element. So you're going to be asked to do that more often. It's going to be in a few more forms than these previous smaller areas. And then the biggest bucket, 21 to 26% of the questions are going to be asking you to explain the function of the narrator or speaker. So sometimes that's going to be similar to explain the function of character because the narrator or speaker might be a character. But even in poetry, where you might not be thinking about having characters, you're going to have to think about the choices that the author's made about the speaker. And so together those, make 100, but also just to think about how some things will be seen more than others, right? There are stronger a larger piece of the puzzle of the multiple choice questions. So definitely expect to definitely expect to answer questions about the function of the speaker or narrator, because those are more likely to happen and more likely to happen with each passage. Whereas function or setting, you're not going to see that in every passage. You're going to see that once, maybe. And then like character, plot, and structure, you might see, on a few, but you're probably going to find, because it's 25% of 4 passages, you're probably going to find something like that in every passage. So here's just an example of the way that a function of the narrator or speaker question might look, because it is the largest bucket, but there are a couple others. But which of the following best describes the speaker's current situation? And I didn't want to give the passage because I think this stream tonight is more about what you might find, what it's going to look like. And so it's got these options about his, quote, current situation, which means that you have to be able to understand by reading that poem what's going on with this speaker. It's very unlikely to be something as simple as he is experiencing writer's block, but it could be, right? That just the simplicity of the phrasing does not mean that it is necessarily a simple question, because probably if it is something that seems simple in the answer, it means that it was difficult to find in the passage. So I'm just thinking about constantly as you're reading, trying to place this speaker in a situation, trying to figure out what it is that the narrator or the speaker is doing, or where the context of the narrator or speaker. So that's how those sort of function questions might go. Function of word choice, imagery, and symbols. Those are the kinds of things that you see all the time when you're interpreting figurative language. In this particular poem, which is Sonnet 60, William Shakespeare's Sonnet 60, in case you'd like to read it and then answer these questions, time is personified. Time is capitalized in the poem. Time is referred to as a person. And so you can look at this as a word choice, imagery, and symbol question because of that figurative language function. But also it's a bit of a character question, because you have to think about if time is doing these things, which time was pretty rude and disrespectful in this poem, and it comes to cut you down like the reaper. And so you're thinking it wasn't the narrator or the speaker, because the speaker was speaking about time. So also thinking about how all of these things are working together, how that personification was created by imagery and characterization. And so that's the kind of thing that you might see there. And also we tend to think about, tone questions or character questions as being fairly simple, but usually they will have some sort of and in here. So see, they've added a complexity to the level of the question just by giving you 2 options about time. And so, you have to take that extra step to make sure the time does both of those things, or is characterized as both of those attributes. And here's one about structure, again, from Sonnet 60. Now, it's important to note that you want to identify, just the same way as you do in your essays, you want to see if the poem that you're reading fits some sort of pattern with which you're familiar. Because if you are reading a sonnet and you know anything about sonnets, you know that first quatrain is probably going to establish something. And so this is a structure question because it's asking about a portion of the poem, but also because it's asking you to recognize that sonnet as a sonnet, because it may not be called sonnet. Sometimes they don't have titles. Most of the multiple choice passages don't have titles. And so you look at it and you read it and you're like, wait a minute, this seems pretty sonnety. I think I get this. And so that makes you look at the first quatrain a little differently. And then it's going to have, these pieces that make sure that you are getting the depths of it. So those are just some sample questions, again, from those from those weights, those skills that you're looking at. And again, these skills are the same skills that are in the course description for your class. And so these are the things that your teachers are constantly giving you at bats for. And so they're not foreign to the rest of the class. It's not separate from what you're writing about or how you're analyzing to read. but I did want to point out that this is kind of the structure of those questions. And so you can know to expect a narrator or speaker question. You can know to expect a plot or structure question, and then it's going to be asking you to have identified already whatever is unique or important about that plot, structure, imagery. So I definitely do recommend that you actually read the passage and maybe even annotate, but I also know that there's a time crunch situation here that's going to make things very difficult. And so I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So here are the pieces that you need to remember in order to make a plan. So I'm going to sit back a little because these are just kind of the shallow names for them. But first of all, you know that there will be 2 poetry and two prose passages. So one of the reasons that you want to practice is because you want to know if you have a strength. If you can say, you know, I do really well on poetry questions. Personally, I love poetry, so I could read it and tear it apart and put it back together all day. And I do it with probably more efficacy and joy than maybe prose, even though I obviously am a lit teacher. I love that too, but I know that I would probably be more likely to go directly to the poetry questions. And it's just a matter of, some of it is preference and some of it is strength. And if you haven't done practices, then you might not have a really strong idea of where your strengths are. And so you want to be able to make choices. And if you have 5 passages and you are a slower reader, then you want to make sure that you are doing as well as possible on the passages that you choose, because you might not have time to read all 5. So if you have poetry, if you have 3 poetry and 2 prose, you can say, like, you can decide for yourself that my plan is, if there are 5 passages and 3 of them are in my area of strength between poetry and prose, I'm going to do those, and I'm going to do those well, and I'm going to do those first. Because obviously, if you get all 39 of those questions, if you get them answered, you're already doing well in your wheelhouse, so to speak. And so you can feel a little more confident about having answered those, because you know that this is something that's a result of the practice that you've done. Relatedly, there's always going to be a little descriptive blurb. It's going to be italicized at the top of the passage, or historically has been. And so it's going to tell you, this is from a book published in 1644. This is from a British writer who moved to America. This is from a anthology of short stories regarding gender. It's going to give you something. Like, it may be detailed, like short stories regarding gender, and it may just be the publication date, but even just the publication date can help you, because you know whether or not you are stronger at older passages. You know this because of the practice that you've done both in and out of class. You know this because you went to the prose multiple choice stream on Fiveable. There's a poetry next week. I missed that slide, but there's a poetry multiple choice stream next week. And so it can help you get some specifically poetry, multiple choice strategies. And so you've practiced with Fiveable, you've practiced with your teacher, you maybe you have a review book and you're practicing out of those, but you're trying to figure out your strengths. You're trying to figure out what you do well so that you can go into the test feeling confident about some choices. So you're going to read the descriptive blurb, and that's going to help you not only choose, but also prioritize. If you know that your strongest area is 16th century British writing, which would make you awesome, and I hope that you are going to major in English literature when you go to college. But if you know that's your strength and you see something in that kind of area, then you can choose that first. And so I just suggest that you read just the blurbs. If you don't read anything else before you start answering questions, just read those blurbs so you can prioritize and order them for yourself. The second thing is that I do suggest that you skim the stems. And so that doesn't mean read every question before you read the passage, but it does mean look and see what are the types of questions that are going to be asked, so that when you read, you have an idea of what it is that you're looking for. Because again, you have 1 minute per question, right? Including reading those passages. And it's going to be difficult to answer the questions without reading the passages. Because even if there are line reference questions where it says, in line 15, what does the speaker establish for the reader? You still have to know that that's what's being established at that point, and it's going to be supported later. So no question is in a silo. And so therefore, you're going to have a general understanding of the passage, not just that line in the question. And so it's a good idea to skim the stems, not to memorize the lines. I know I'm looking at line 4 and line 14, but so that you do have just a little bit of memory in your eye, right? A little bit of visual memory of, I'm going to have to look for tone. I'm going to have to look for theme. They're going to ask me about the character, what the speaker establishes for the reader. And so it's a good idea to know what those stems are asking. Like I said, 1 minute per question. And that feels very rushed, right? But again, if you've done these first 3, if you've made sure that you are strong, that you know your strengths, that you've read the blurbs and you've prioritized, I'm going to read passage 3, then 2, then 4, then 1, then you are getting this closer and closer to your strongest showing. And so you just have to practice in order to know how to do these things. You have to practice to know that you are that, 12th century British expert, but you also have to practice to know that you are better at prose than poetry. And some of that is just reading. Some of it's not actually answering multiple choice questions. It's just when you read in class or when you have taken literature classes, period, are you stronger at analyzing poetry or prose? And if you're strong at both, then excellent, right? But you still want to make some choices about where you start and where you end in answering those multiple choice questions. Once you've skimmed the stems and you have a pretty good idea, then you want to annotate the passage as much as you can remember, right, for the types of questions that are going to be asked and the content of those questions. And so that's looking at what level of inference is going to be necessary for the question, keeping in mind, if you see a lot of questions that use the word inference, that use words like meaning or tone, as opposed to words like device, or even, characterization or characterized, just having a general feeling for the depth that you're going to need to go into in order to answer those questions. So you want to annotate the passage with those things in mind. Again, I'm not asking you to remember line numbers. I'm not asking you to take down line numbers as you skim the stems. I'm just saying that it's a good idea to jot down what you took in, so that it can guide your reading. There will be many, many line reference questions. I feel like this is something that the College Board has been pushing toward for the past few years, more and more specific references. But you want to use that. You want to keep in mind where the lines are, but you don't want to assume that going to that line without reading the passage is going to make you stronger in answering the questions, because you'll spend more time looking than you will remembering. And that's something to keep in mind whenever you have read something, whenever you might have a quiz. You may or may not have read. It takes longer to look for it than it does to remember where it is. Because if you've seen it, your brain will remember it or have some memory of it. And so you want to take all of this. This is kind of the pre-steps, right? You've already established who you are and what you're doing. You've read the blurbs so that you can plan well. You've skimmed the stems so you know generally what's being asked of you. You looked at the content so you know what level you're going to need to go to. And so you're ready to look at that passage. You're ready to read the passage and keep in mind those line references. Remember that the order of the questions that you answer, like, nobody knows. We don't have any idea, or not we, because I'm not grading multiple choice, scoring multiple choice. But remember that whatever they run it through has no idea if you answered 30 and then went back to 12. It doesn't matter, right? So know yourself so that you can answer the quickest ones first. I'm going to say easiest. That's relative, obviously, but easy to you, right? Easy for you to dig into, or the ones that are more factual than analytical. Go ahead and answer those first, because those are your first sets of right answers. And definitely, I welcome you not to necessarily jump all around in the passages, but to leave questions unanswered because they're taking a long time. I think that's a test-taking strategy in almost every test, especially tests where you are not penalized for not answering. But leave the question unanswered until you can go back. You have 3-4 other passages to read, right? So you don't want to get bogged down. The order that you answer the questions, the order that you read the passages, the order that you go back to the passages, none of that matters, right? So you get to decide that in that moment. And then, different people will say different things, but I say read the passage. I think it's a really strong idea to read the passage once you've kind of skimmed all of this stuff. And it sounds like a lot to call it a skim, but it really is not so much, and it definitely gets faster the more you try it. And so if you can answer the questions without looking at the choices, then obviously you have a stronger understanding. And so you want to actually read it so that you can say to yourself, note to yourself what the tone is, or note to yourself this characterization, annotate like you would if you were reading, just faster. If you were just, reading this for a quiz or to write an essay that doesn't have time constraints. But, you're looking for those same things. And the reason why I keep stressing that the skills are the same is because these are the same pieces. These are the same pieces that you're looking at all the time when you read. It's the same levels of analysis. It's the same ideas that you're analyzing. And so if you know, because you skimmed the stems, that there are going to be characterization questions, tone questions, and theme questions, then when you actually get to reading, you're looking for those things. So you're honing in when it says, where someone's from, or what they do, or what they're like, or how people interact with them. I do think that the passages are chosen to be strong in one way or another. So, for example, you might have a passage that is very strong in characterization, and that's where you'll get that lean, the heavier weight of characterization. It might be the speaker, the function of the speaker is to, or the function of the narrator is to really characterize that person. There are obviously, you've been reading for a while now, you know that there are all sorts of ways that authors do things and create things, and all sorts of elements and devices that you're constantly being asked to analyze for. But knowing is half the battle. That's what G.I. Joe said. And so it's true, to know what you're getting yourself into before you even look at that passage is a really strong benefit for you. And so you want to actually read it so that you know what it says. But you're reading it after you've already taken all those, kind of notes and memorize those things. So the last piece is just these are the kinds of stems you'll see. Again, there were the example questions. The functions of the words blank and blank is primarily, so right, it's not going to ask you what kind of diction this is necessarily. It's going to give you some diction and ask you to identify what the function of those words is. And again, word choice, imagery, and symbols is one big skill set, but to know the function. And remember that all of those skills, except for the textually substantiated argument, they all started with function. So it's always going to be what's being built by using these devices, these symbols, this imagery, this particular narrator. Not so much what person is, is the narrator speaking in first person, third person, omniscient, but what is the function of that omniscient narrator and what impact does it have on the passage. So also, which of the following statements best conveys? That's probably going to be something like theme. Which of the following statements best conveys the meaning of the passage as a whole? We know meaning of the work as a whole is a huge thing. It may or may not show up in a multiple choice question, but you're going to have to choose. So again, this is one of those instances where it's a really good idea to think what the answer is, so that you can identify the answer, not look for the answer, right? So you want to be able to say, okay, well, I've seen this, and I know that this is the big message that's being sent to me through passage voicemail from the author. I always say that. I always say the theme is like, the author leaving you a message like, hey, really succinctly, this is what I just said. This is what you need to know. But you've identified the theme, and you have the caller ID, and you are able to say, oh, he told me that. Rather than, what did he tell me? I got to look at all these choices, right? You know which ones are wrong when going in. Which of the following can be reasonably inferred? Again, that's one of those analytical questions. That's looking beyond the lines. What can when you add yourself to the words, what are you able to see? And then, these specific line reference questions. And they'll give you a quote and ask you to say what it refers to. There used to be a lot of pronoun questions that would happen, like basically trying to figure out who it was referring to. I think that's something that has shifted out, but it will be asking the big idea that it's referring to. And then shifts. If you've ever seen me stream before, I said something about a shift because they're so important. And so you need to know where the shifts are. Again, that's a reason to know poetry forms so that you can expect shifts, but also the effect of the shift. So what are we shifting between? Are we going from neutral into drive? Are we going from park straight to drive? Like, what's happening here? Who is it happening to? So what is the effect? And shifts don't only happen in poems. I think we talk about them, we teachers talk about them a lot in poems, but they happen everywhere. There's always authors and poets are always making that choice to shift in tone, shift in meaning, shift in dialect, shift in dialogue, shift in narration, even shift in time, just constantly moving from one idea to the other. So that's my overview. I feel like that was kind of a lot of me talking and showing and explaining. And so I just wanted to kind of give you the biggest umbrella, right? These are the biggest things to expect. Again, there are things that are specific to poetry, specific to prose, but also those are things that will be leaned into in later streams. But some of these things are just anytime, right? In whatever passage you find, you're going to get these kinds of stems. You're going to get those kind of questions that I showed before. And also your plan of attack overall can be the same depending on who you are and where your strengths are. So thank you so much for those of you who are here live joining me. If you have any questions, please ask them. Okay, what are the most up-to-date resources for practice questions? Yeah, so one of the unfortunate facts right now, because they have just changed they changed Lang questions and they changed the lit format, that a lot of the most up-to-date questions are behind, some sort of paywall. And so there are questions available on College Board that represent the changes. There are questions, obviously, in the newest, practice books come out with one every year, regardless of how many changes there have been. So obviously those are up to date. And also, I think teachers are trying to create questions that, align with the changes. I think because they are new, it's hard to have as large of a body. But not everything has changed. And so there are quite a few question review resources, including Fiveable, that are available that are most up to date. And so I think, and let me know what you think about this, because I feel like it's hard to create trivia for lit because it goes so quickly. But I wonder if you think that it would be useful to have multiple choice trivia, like maybe you get to look at the passage for a much longer time than most questions. And then the multiple choice questions would be the trivia questions. If you think that would be something that would be useful, that would be something that could happen quickly and without a, live person. But also that we will have streams with questions that are based on up-to-date resources. So yeah, I think at this point, College Board is the strongest resource, the strongest, freest resource, because it is free to you and to us. But also, I don't know if your teachers have been using the College Board My Classroom, where you log in and take practice quizzes, multiple choice questions. That is free. And so that's an option too, because again, it's College Board based. And so I'm going to say that I think College Board is right now the strongest resource for the newest questions, but also that multiple choice lit questions have not changed drastically. So you could go a few years back and probably find that they would be still appropriate for practice. Anything else on your mind regarding multiple choice? Yeah, no problem. Now that it's early and I'm finishing, I'm like, we could have actually done some, huh? I could have given you a little quick passage. But if there's nothing else, thank you so much for coming, for paying attention, for being quietly attentive. And again, next week, the 10th at 8 a.m., 8 p.m., sorry, not 8 a.m. Next week, the 10th at 8 p.m., there will be a poetry multiple choice analysis and strategies stream. So definitely come through whether you're strong in poetry or not, because again, you cannot get enough practice. And we also want to provide you with practice questions, as many practice opportunities as possible. And also look out for trivia, because I think that's something that I just thought about could happen. And so I'll think about how that might work. And again, the trivia is you just, log on and play. You just answer. It's kind of like a non-manned Kahoot. So that could be a cool thing. And if there's not anything else, thank you so much. And we'll see you next time.